find a lot of really interesting things in Proudhon's writings. So that's, and I find, I must say that if I had to say in whom are you going to find more ideas relevant to present problems of socialism, I would right now cautiously say that I would prefer Proudhon to Marx. More in Proudhon, more innovative ideas in Proudhon about where to go and what to do and how to do it, both at the economic and political levels than in Marx, which is a pretty bold statement, because Marx is a much greater philosopher or much greater thinker, much more consistent, and so on. And yet, in Proudhon, there is a lot, and we want to talk about that today. So, Chiara, you start.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, that is a great passage into what I want to say, in the sense that, to begin with, I think that Proudhon suffered of Marx way too successful condemnation. So that's the reason why I remain marginalized. And I want to speak mainly about what I think are the main philosophical ideas at the basis of his thinking, which, although it changes a lot throughout the years, and so we have a variety of positions which at times appear to be in contradiction with what he sustained at the very beginning, I do think that they respond to the same inspiring intuitions. So to begin with, I mean, we should also say that Marx does say in The Holy Family that Proudhon put forward one of the first truly scientific critique of property. And Proudhon himself calls his view of anarchy at the end of this book scientific socialism, right? So we can discuss the way in which this label scientific was used at the time also as a polemical tool to discard other people's view. That's utopianism, I am scientific, this is scientific, that one is not. But what we should say is from the very start, Proudhon is not, in a way, certainly not like Marx, somebody who has had the chance to be schooled in a university system. So, and I think that some of the criticism that we see in the letter that was assigned for today is clearly the criticism of somebody who has had the chance to sit down at Hegel's, or various professors' lectures and can criticize Proudhon for being bad Hegelianism, so to speak, bad theory, right? So, and you see in the writing style, Proudhon is completely self-taught. He studied, he comes from Besançon, so relatively the periphery. He starts college, but has to give up almost immediately because he has to work, right? So he's self-taught. And I think you see in his writing style both a freshness of thinking, I mean, a way to begin from intuitions, and that are almost common sense, but that suddenly reveals something of their very common sense which we may have lost. At the same time, there's also, in particular, I think, in what is property, you see also the sort of zealous of somebody who is not being trained in the school, so to speak, and you see it in the writing style, which doesn't come out as great because he quotes way too much the people he's criticizing, and he put forward a lot of the argument as a critique of other people's view, whereas people who would be more self-confident, they would just go straight to their own point. Whereas you see somebody who comes from a very humble origins, feels the need of criticizing X, Y, Z before making their points. So all this to say that I do think we have to to take with a grain of salt Marx's critique and try to read Proudhon in its autonomy, in its text. I mainly want to focus on the critique of property, so a very early text, because I do think that there's something in this text, on one hand, which is very important for Proudhon throughout the development of his career, but also for us today. And I'm actually, I keep actually going back to this text for what I'm currently writing, a book I'm currently writing. So, what is why this text? Because in my view, it's here that you find really the philosophical cornerstone of his thinking. And the cornerstone is the critique of property. The critique of property, which is done at different levels, and we see in this text that he distinguishes between property and possession, but later on the distinction is not so clear. We can summarize perhaps his approach to property with a later statement that comes from his theory of property, where he says property is theft, which is what we read here, but also property is freedom, right? And some people think, okay, you know, this is a total contradiction, it doesn't make any sense. This guy got old and therefore, you know, simply became very conservative. I think that that would be unfair. I think that there's something that we can recognize from early on in his distinction between property and possession, which later on leads to this sort of strange idea that property is both theft and one of the tools, right, for resistance and the critique of the state. So, straight to the main philosophical point. He begins with this intuition that he takes from Ciccero's image of the earth as a theater. Right? So, the starting point is that we are all born to this planet. Right? So, he didn't use the word planet because he didn't have that astronomical view, but I think today it's particularly timely as an observation. So we're all born to the earth, which is this theater. Now you get into the theater, you occupy a seat. Now and you are entitled to occupy a seat because there's no other place where you can go. Now try to imagine somebody getting into the theater and trying to occupy a lot of seats because, you know, yeah, my friends may be coming, may have my kids will be coming and trying to occupy all of them. So that act of appropriation of other seats is what is in Proudhon's view illegitimate. On the other hand, the right to occupy one seat, which is what he claims is possession, is justified by the fact that we're here in this theater, we have no other place to go. And there are elements that are needed for us to remain sitting in our seat. And he mentions air, water, light, and land. And then he goes on to the critique of the argument according to which, whereas air, water, and light cannot be subject of property because they are not stable, land can be the subject of property because it is stable. And his argument against this, I think, is pretty convincing. Well, first of all, people tried to occupy the sea, they tried to occupy water, and actually, whenever they succeeded, they did it, and they're still doing it. For instance, with the right to fish in certain areas and not in others. The Dutch tried to say that a certain route was their own, but then Grotzu says that the sea cannot be subject to property. But anyway, so that's air and water, and we can say now light, and you see how timely this is in terms of our contemporary discussion on climate change is. We can say that actually Proudhon was right, and that even air and water can actually be subject to claim to property, right? The point is not, therefore, to oppose them to land. And he also says the fact that land has been more often subject of property rights is only the sign that is actually more easily sizable. But the fact that it's more easily sizable doesn't make it a right. So it doesn't justify it. So, and I mean, I think there is this passage on page that I want to read that beautifully summarizes his argument. He says, not only does occupation lead to equality, it prevents property. For every man, simply because he exists, he has the right of occupation, and in order to live, cannot do without material for cultivation and labor. And on the other hand, the number of, that's a crucial point, and later on in the text it even said that there's a mathematical contradiction at the basis of property, right? What is the mathematical contradiction? That we don't know how many people we don't decide to be born, we don't get to choose who we're going to be born with, and we don't know how many people are going to be born after us, right? So, going back to the initial image of the theater, we don't know how many people are going to be at this spectacle, which is life on planet Earth, so we can't just get there and grab all the seats, right? And it says, on the other hand, the number of occupants varies continually according to the birth and death. It follows that the quantity of material which each laborer can claim varies with the number of occupants. That consequently, occupation is always subordinate to population, and finally, that possession, according to law, can never remain fixed. And so it is impossible for it to ever become property. And so this is, I think, is the most important point. And then it continues, every occupant is then necessarily a possessor or usufructuary, a condition that excludes proprietorship. The right of the usufructuary is such that he is responsible for the thing entrusted to him. He must use it in conformity with general utility, with a view to the preservation and development of the thing. He has no power to transform it, to diminish it, or to change its nature. He cannot divide the usufruct so that another performs the labor while he receives the product. In a word, the usufructuary is under the supervision of society and subject to the condition of labor and the law of equality. Thus is annihilated the Roman definition of property, defined as the right to use and abuse of something, and immorality born of violence, the most monstrous pretensions that the civil laws ever sanctioned. Man receives his usufruct from the hands of society, which alone possess it in a permanent way. The individual passes away, but society never dies. And so I think this is the most important point for us. We don't know how many people are going to be born to this theater, which is life on earth. We know that individual passes, but society remains. So this, I think, goes for the critique that possession could generate a right to property. Quite on the contrary, as it says, it destroys it. And this is a view that I think is, in a way, very similar to the sort of cosmopolitan argument that Immanuel Kant was developing in his writings, with the difference that I think in Proudhon there is a much more sophisticated attention to the question of property, to the question also of the way in which different forms of economic production are intertwined with the processes of production of life. So there's attention to air, light, food, and what is actually needed in order for life to survive and proliferate. Indeed, as he criticized the idea that air, water, and light cannot be appropriated, but land can, he says, water, air, and light are common things not because they are inexhaustible, which we now know is no longer the case because they are not inexhaustible, but because they are indispensable. And indeed, so indispensable that nature seems to have created them in quantities almost infinite so that their plentifulness might prevent their appropriation. Similarly, the land is indispensable to our existence, thus a common thing and is susceptible of appropriation. But land is much scarcer than the other elements, so its use must be regulated not for profit of a few, but in the interest and for the security of all. In short, equality of rights is proved by equality of needs. So, okay, this is, I'm taking too much time. Yes, because there's so much I want to say on this, but I know I don't know. So, with regard to the other main argument that is not simply occupation, but rather labor that can create the right to property, his critique, I think, is equally strong, poignant, and philosophically sharp. Labor does not create a right to property because wealth is always socially generated. And I think that here I can quote, there's a passage that summarizes this argument way better than I could. He makes this argument both for what concerns the creation of material capital, but also the creation of mental capital. And he clearly comes to the conclusion that all capital, whether material or mental, is the result of collective labor, and therefore it is always collective property. So with the example of material labor, he gives this example of the obelisk in Luxor. And he says, the capitalists, they say, has paid the laborer their daily wages. More precisely, it should be said that the capitalist has paid as many times one day's wage as he has employed laborer each day, which is not at all the same thing. For he has paid nothing for that immense power which results from the union and harmony of laborers and the convergence and simultaneity of their efforts. 200 grenadiers set the obelisk of Luxor on its base in a few hours. Do you suppose that one man could have accomplished the same task in 200 days? Right? So setting up the obelisk is a clear example of something that a number of laborers together can accomplish very quickly, but a single laborer never could do so. Similarly, he makes another example at some point about somebody who's becoming a doctor, and we can think, okay, you have paid, we can say in contemporary terms, your tuition fees, you're now a doctor, that's your intellectual capital. But you have paid the tuition fees, let's say, to go to class and maybe get the salary of the professor here paid, but you have not paid for the labor that Joseph Proudhon has done. You have not paid for the labor that has been done to produce the paper of this book that has enabled me to read this. You have not paid for the labor that my parents did to bring me up or bring up all the people who are part of this room. You have not paid for the labor, let's say, of all the ideas that people are sharing in the course of this seminar, right? Including that of your fellow students. So, in conclusion, divide et impera, divide et conquer, divide and you will become rich, divide and you will deceive men, dazzle their minds, and mock justice. Separate laborers from each other, and each one's daily wage may exceed the value of each individual product. But that is not the question here. A force of 1,000 men working for 20 days has been paid the same as a force of one working 55 years. But this force of 1,000 has done in 20 days what a single man working continuously for a million centuries could not accomplish. Is this exchange equitable? Once more, no. For when you have paid all of the individual forces, you have still not paid the collective force. And this is the point. You can pay individually every people here who are going to speak and give an idea out, but you will have never paid for the collective force that stems from having all of us here debating ideas together. Does that make sense? Now apply this to an entire person education. Consequently, there always remains a right to collective property which you have not acquired and which you enjoy unjustly. Now, why do I focus on this? Because I think this critique of private property as a system remains at the basis of his thought, and these intuitions about the interconnectedness of the different forms of life, something that is in common with other anarchist thinkers, remains there throughout all of his career, although I think it changes considerably, right? So for instance, in this text, he is critical of certain communist proposal about the collectivization of the means of production. He thinks that whereas as I said, every capital is collective property, but he thinks that the only way to guarantee some freedom is to leave each of us the possession of the means of production, not the property, the possession of the means of production. And he thinks that by entrusting the state authority with the regulation of all the means of production, you would end up in a system that is authoritarian. And this anticipates the debate also between Marx and Bakunin, which was always on the question of the state. And the idea being that a state of proletariat will still be authoritarian as every other form of state, because it's the rule of a minority, whether it is the minority of the party or the minority of the capitalist, is still the rule of the minority over a majority, right? So, okay, let me try to wrap ideas together. So what he favors instead is the idea of a plurality of association, each of them autonomous but also connected with others, within but also possibly beyond national boundaries. And this is another aspect that I think goes back to this fundamental image about the common property, common possession of the earth, which justifies forms of association that are not necessarily bound to the national borders. But I do think that this is also linked to his definition of anarchy, which in this text is actually one of the first times that is elaborated. According to Bakunin, actually, is the very first historical example of somebody defining himself as an anarchist. So maybe I can wrap up my intervention by reading that part, which wasn't in the readings, but I think it may be relevant for the rest of the discussion. First of all, he says, yes, so if you ask me what is this position that I'm proposing, is that interesting? He says, is that Republican? And he says, I think this is worth reading against today Republicans. Yes, a Republican, of course, but this word defines nothing. res publica, that is the public thing, like who's not Republican, right? Now, whoever is concerned with public affairs under whatever form of government may call themselves Republicans. Even kings can call themselves Republicans. Then, where you're a Democrat, no, I'm not a Democrat, you're a monarchist, no, I am blah, 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 I am an anarchist. And then when it goes into the definition of anarchy, which, I mean, is inside this strange chapter on the psychological exposition of the idea of just and unjust. So it may go unnoticed. What I think is interesting here is that in order to define what it means to be an anarchist, it begins with the fact, which I think it takes from Etienne Bottici, that we are all born, or most of the time, we are born from parents. And we tend to, by habit, to be used, precisely because in contemporary terms we would say we're born as premature animals. We tend to obey to the, he calls it paternal. There's also a lot of discussion that can be had about is sexism, but we could say we're always born into parental authority, right? So we trust somebody else to tell us what to do. So this creates in every human being a habit for following leaders, needing somebody else's guidance. But then he says, as human beings grow and become more autonomous, as society becomes more autonomous, you start questioning their authority. Why am I obeying? Is this command legitimate? And this is this very process of critical engagement with the habit of obeying that leads ultimately to being an anarchist, which he defines as questioning the existence of a master. And so I read this point and then I conclude. He says, in a given society, the authority of man over man is universally proportional to the intellectual development which that society has reached, and the probable duration of that authority can be calculated from the more or less general desire for a true government, that is, for a government based on science. And just as the right of force and the right of stratagem retreat before the growing awareness of justice and must finally be extinguished in equality, so the sovereignty of the will gives way to the sovereignty of reasons and ends up being replaced by a scientific socialism. Again, he calls it socialism scientific. Property and royalty have been crumbling ever since the beginning of the world. As man seeks justice in equality, so society seeks order in anarchy. Anarchy, the absence of a master, of a sovereign, such is the form of government to which we are approaching every day, and which our inveterate habit of taking man for our rule and his will for our law lead us to regard as the height of disorder and the expression of chaos. There is a story about a citizen of Paris in the 17th century. Having heard it say that in Venice there was no king, the good man could not recover from his astonishment. He almost died from laughter at the news of such a ridiculous thing. And how could there be a place without a king, let alone Venice? Such is the strength of our prejudice. As long as we live, we want a leader or leaders. And at this very moment, I hold in my hand a pamphlet was authored a zealous communist dreams like a second Marat of a dictatorship. I don't know what's this pamphlet, but we can speculate. The most advanced among us are those who wish the greatest possible number of sovereigns. So the greatest possible number of sovereigns meaning federations and voluntary associations. The most ardent wish is for the royalty of the National Guard. Undoubtedly, someone jealous of the citizen militia will soon say, so, and then everyone is a king, But when he has spoken, I will say in turn, no one is a king. We all are, whether we like it or not, associated. So I think you see in this quotation that closes the what is property, the idea that the point is not to replace one form of government with another, or one king with another, or not even all of us becoming king, but all of us becoming aware that we are, whether we like it or not, associated. And
That's it. Thank you very much. It was really, really interesting. What I would like to do, and I think it kind of becomes my role anyway with all these philosophers who speak in these sessions, is then to translate, not in terms of my ideas, but in terms of the author's ideas, the fundamental assumptions to a political project, even a political program in Proudhon's case, Engels' case too, very much participate in actual politics, more so, either of them more so than Marx. But I want to begin with the issue that you raised in order to link up the presentations. I mean, I didn't find nothing, of course, to disagree with what you presented on the question of property and possession. But I can add to it that Proudhon then does raise the question, if this thing is illegitimate and unjust, which is his view, how come we got it? I mean, very often his language confuses is and ought between what is and what ought to be, but we can distinguish, right? He of course knows on the level of the is, there is property, right? And it cannot be because of the rights of the first occupiers. You have already shown why that would be absurd. He also tries to show it cannot be because of labor, because then we should all have equal property on the basis of either of this, the theater metaphor for occupation, and the labor metaphor, because labor is part of life. In order to live, to be without property is almost as serious an injury to our life and lives, not to have possession, I should say, than not to have air or not to have water. So that derivation is absurd too, and he then says, well, the civil law is what establishes it. Quoting the scriptures, he says, and in this case referring to one version of the civil law, the Roman, when they did it, they didn't know what they were doing. They know not what they do, he says, right? Obviously, this is the language of the gospel in relationship to Christ's executioners. The people, when they enacted the law of property, a very, very strong version of it, by the way, the Roman is the strongest, they didn't know what the hell they were doing, because they were depriving themselves, the majority of them, of the possibility of life. I mean, that's essentially the argument. So that's how it was done. And then, of course, with this, he can introduce more than just the theory of property, also his theory of politics. Because the Romans had one particular political order, a kind of aristocratic republic with slavery. There were other political orders before and after, and they all did it in one form or another. Even popular sovereignty, and he gives a consistent and strong critique of popular sovereignty, which I think all critics of populism can well read even today. Even popular sovereignty didn't change anything. And popular sovereignty, which ought to have been also the road to a different property order, was not. So this brings me to his concept of revolution. And obviously, Chiara's excellent presentation did not raise that, and because of lack of time too, could not raise the question of how to accomplish the ought, or what is right. And Proudhon is a revolutionary. In this sense, he is with Marx and Engels, and that's why scientific socialism also appears in his work. He actually does not think that the goal is to create model communities only or to create intellectual schemes which are so convincing, almost in a Habermasian way, right, that no one can disagree and people will establish it. Proudhon believes that it takes acts of power, takes political acts, and the revolution is that political act. Revolution is not just a mental revolution, occasionally that's the way he uses the term too, but it is also political revolution. And just as Marx, he is under the aegis of the revolution of their time, which is not Hannah Arendt, right? Not the American Revolution, but the French. He will say in the Federalism book something about America, quite interesting, but the whole interest, and he's a French person, is the French Revolution. And he says things which are very similar to Marx, and on the Jewish question, for example. Marx, I don't know how many of you read these texts now. We, in the 1960s, 70s, we read them all. Marx in the Jewish question makes the point that the political revolution, the French, was only partial. It did not amount to human emancipation, as the text of that essay says. And this, I think, Proudhon, though he didn't read that particular essay, fully agrees with. The French Revolution is only partial. It accomplished a political change which he, as Marx in 1843, thinks was positive because it represents an improvement over the previous autocratic form of the old regime. But nevertheless, it did not accomplish the economic transformation, the establishment of society, as he, in his language, by which he means, of course, a free society. Moreover, he also suggests, in this sense, that the revolution of his own time, which he participated in, was even elected to the Constituent Assembly in 1848, also is pretty much on the road not to accomplish the double task of both creating a new form of government, which in any case he would have doubts about as a ultimate goal. But certainly it has not, in spite of the role of workers and the downtrodden, accomplished its economic tasks either. So in this sense, he's a revolutionary, but he wants a complete and more fundamental revolution, which involves radical transformation of everything. And now comes the paradox. It also has to accomplish a transformation of the political order by indeed abolishing the political order which it relies on in order to inaugurate its initial policies. There are a lot of reasons why he says this. One of them, of course, is pragmatic, but I think there is the implicit assumption, which then becomes much stronger in the Marx Engels conception of dictatorship proletariat, that it would require a lot of political force to establish the language changes, right? Originally freedom of possession, then it becomes equality of property later on in his other writings. But whatever it is, it will require political acts, and it will require a transitional process. You can see this in his other writings now, and I turn to the revolution of the 19th century, which has much more details about the political program. You can certainly see that he even has a three-step process. And then elsewhere in the same text, he seems to be talking about a two-step process: dissolution and reconstruction. That's like Hannah Arendt's idea, by the way, on revolution, where the first stage of the revolution is negative, but it is not yet a revolution. That's just liberation, that stage. And one needs also the constructive stage. And that constructive stage would still rely on, he says in this essay, not in the property book, on the institutions like the National Assembly, like even universal suffrage. But it would be their last act, because they too represent authority in the sense that, Proudhon condemns. All right, so that's the general frame. It's always a problem for revolutionaries how to accomplish very radical tasks. And, you know, Bernie Sanders can throw around the word political revolution, but he's not really explaining how, given the American system, with its separation of powers, federalism, all the rest, how you would do such a thing. I think Elizabeth Warren is somewhat better, at least on that particular subject. But I think this is always a problem, and you can see Proudhon grappling with it in several essays, and Marx in Critique of the Grotha program in particular, where he talks about a transitional epoch, and then Lenin in State and Revolution. This issue comes back all the time, because you can't just go from the empirical to the desirable through some kind of leap that God would, of course, be capable of by recreating humanity in some new way. We can't do it. We require a transitional process. Let me say something about that. I got to watch the time so that I don't abuse, well, I think maybe I have 10 more minutes, take away the possibility of you discussing it. It is in this context that he's the most interesting to me. I'm a philosopher. I used to teach philosophy a long time ago, but I have not for 30 years or so. And I'm not certainly a philosopher now. So for me, the most interesting part comes now. Class, of course, people can have different views on what is important here. But it is here that he has to think about how to do such a thing. And first, the problem of violence against non-violence comes up. He tends to eventually opt for non-violence. By the way, you see this in Engels too. Marx himself never really said that this could be done in a non-violent way in democratic countries, but Engels also came to that view. So in that respect, Proudhon is not alone. And obviously, if you go back to the utopian socialists, Owen or Saint-Simon or Fourier never thought for a minute that you would actually accomplish a task violently. So in that sense, the line from Marx to Lenin, stressing the violent nature of the revolution, almost inevitably so, is one that is really a minority view originally in the history of socialism. It becomes perhaps a much more general view of revolutionary socialism in the 20th. Proudhon himself shifts on that particular question, which of course even makes the transitional problem even more long, because if you really could act violently and destroy all the existing institutions, then you would be like God, actually, in my metaphor previously. Then, of course, maybe the idea of a short time is possible. Proudhon, being quite pragmatic, in one text says, well, some of it will have to be done right away, some of it will take 25 years, and some of it 50. It's nice that he actually sees that there are different levels to the problem. What are the things that can be accomplished quickly, and then one of them, and what will take much longer. The same question also reappears in Marx, and I'll say a little bit about his writings on the Paris Commune at the end of this. The thing that can be done fast is called disillusion by him. So it means, and he is really very inconsistent on this subject, but I'll try to simplify it, is that Karl Kautsky, for example, spoke about the day after. What are the things you could do the day after, or at least initiate the day after? And he mentions things in this context like alteration of the ownership structure, like the creation of a new system of credit, by creating a system in which equivalent exchanges are guaranteed through fairer or just prices. These are all categories that he raises. Let me begin with the most interesting one. which you would probably never think of because revolutionaries since the 19th century never think of this. It is, well, reformists do, but revolutionists rarely, is credit. I mean, what does credit have to do with anything, right? You would ask. Well, credit is, and for Proudhon, is as fundamental as labor itself, is the ability to labor over time without immediate results. Because if there is no credit, you can't sustain yourself and your family. For 2, 3, 4, 5 years, you finally manage to convert your goods into other goods or money or whatever it is, a system that would then still be there. So credit is fundamental. And this actually Proudhon did try to do something about by establishing a people's bank. Engels points out that the idea already is there in Saint-Simon. Fine, nothing really is original, but Proudhon actually tried to create such a bank and try to get his friends like Alexander Herzen, who was one of his rich money givers, to finance the project. And only because Napoleon's coup, when he had to escape, did he have to abandon it. But credit is all important, because if the next step comes, people will need credit. Now, who are they? Well, the reconstruction of the property system for him was a complex matter. It's not anymore so simply, by the time he actually gets down to pragmatics, a question of converting the whole thing into a theater in terms of pure possession, which then the number of seats would have to be in a way determined on the basis of size of population. It's a kind of strange theater metaphor, right? Because the population increases, you have a certain number of seats. What if the population doubles? Well, you're going to have to create more seats. The theater metaphor of Cicero at this point doesn't really work, but it makes a lot of sense for the earth, right? How many possessors, users there will be will also depend on a question of population growth. But he has a more complicated problem than even demography, and that is stratification. Most of the people are peasants, but there are also small workshops, and there are even large firms. And possession cannot be, or now I think the term is increasingly property, but a regulated form of property, which is derived from his critique of absolute property, and it is a way of converting the idea of possession into something concrete. We'll have to also take into account what the people themselves are doing and what they want. The most striking example is the peasantry. Now you know, all of you know, if you know the history of socialism, what trouble already Marx has with the peasants, not to speak about Lenin and Trotsky, and then Stalin, who carries on a veritable war against the peasant. Proudhon warns in advance. They really want private ownership. They want to own themselves. And the idea of forcing them into collective property of some kind would be totally resisted. This is, I think, ultimately the critique of communism. He thinks that for a majority peasant country, or a country with a lot of peasants, it will be resisted to the end by the majority of the population. Of course, yeah, in the middle 20th century, lots of countries, peasants no longer a majority. But this is the 19th century, and to Russia, where after all the thing was tried out in the most radical way, it remained a question into the Soviet Union, into the 1930s, and even beyond. And now you can see with Deng Xiaoping, right, that it returns. It returns. In that sense, Proudhon anticipates even the problem of Deng, because it's not working the other way. And the people are resisting, by withholding work, or by fighting, or by sabotage, or whatever it is. And so all the way from Proudhon to Lenin's new economic policy to Deng Xiaoping, the Proudhonian idea turns out to be even then still relevant. So that's one form of property. But there is another form of property, and that's the small merchants who are increasing in number. That's France at the time. And they are a category relatively similar to peasantry. And in that sense, the property of small workshops would also have to be conceded. In that sense, possession for them would still amount to individual ownership. But there is the third form. This is where Engels' critique of Proudhon in his introduction to the civil wars of France comes up with, I think, a really valid argument against Proudhon, but it is not entirely fair if you look at all the writings of Proudhon. Because for large firms, factories, which already exist in France at the time, and if you go across the channel, there are many more of them there, the model of peasant agriculture or even the small workshop is now irrelevant. You can't parcel out the factory to the individual property of every single factory worker there. And the industrial workers have an alternative, which they are experimenting with. It is something that it is not unrelated to the utopian socialism of Saint-Simon and Fourier and Owen, and that's the association. The valid part of Engels' critique of Proudhon is that Proudhon writes a whole chapter attacking associations. This is a very strange part of the work of the revolution of the 19th century, the attack on associations. But I think to his benefit we have to say he didn't really mean it. Or he just meant it as a protection of the peasant. The peasant should not be forced into collectives or associations because they don't really want it. But people who are already in associations should be taken seriously. And so toward the end of the very same diatribe against association, a part that Engels neglects in his critique, Proudhon says, well, for the large firms, of course, you need the association. So that will be yet another property form which will, in a sense, preserve the right of possession, in other words, preserve labor, preserve the ability of labor to guarantee the person's life. Now, two more steps, and I stop. Remember, Axel Honneth criticizes the socialists of the 19th century for not paying attention to the political. That's not a criticism, even in terms of what you said, that is entirely valid of Proudhon, because Proudhon thinks the key even to the wrong system of property is political authority, government, and his anarchism is initially formulated in order to escape that trap. But the question now becomes what actually you put in the place of the political, or put in the place of the state version of the political, in order to have a system in which the new and plural forms of property, the new ways of organizing possession, could be guaranteed and sustained. And he doesn't trust even democracy. Because even in democracy, representative democracy, you're going to elect leaders, you're going to elect representatives who will again be prejudiced, and this is the French story after all of 1848, but also 1789, be prejudiced in favor of exclusionary versions of property. So you need an entirely new form, even beyond political democracy. Again, something we could debate in this class, he attacks also direct democracy in this context. Direct democracy, whether popular legislation or popular executive, again would not solve the task, not because of ill will, but because, and the passages are quite remarkable on this. I don't know how a Swiss person would respond to this, because only you have experience. He explains how really referenda are misleading. The people who create the questions control things, and the people who vote are unable to really decide between alternatives, and they really don't know the consequences. Well, of course, you see Brexit, which is a very strong example of how referendum democracy can go wrong. Proudhon sees all those issues. So you got to put something else in its place. And I think that until the essay, the book on federalism, he's not able to come up with that. even though he now has an industrial organization, which is based on associationism, even though he now has a property system, and even he has now admitted that perhaps in a transitional period it's going to have to be the old organs of the old state that will establish the outlines of the dissolution of the old system. Where are we going to go politically? What do you put in its place? And he himself, very unfortunately, Axel Honneth would register this, has coined the idea of replacing politics by economics. We don't need political solutions, but purely economic ones. But of course, you need to put some system of decision-making also in the place of the old political. And he doesn't come up with one until the essay on federalism. I won't say too much about this, except that the system, I'll just describe what he has in mind, is still an attempt to realize what he attempted to achieve through his anarchism, namely, fundamentally, the replacement of vertical by horizontal relations.
Right.
Replacement of vertical by horizontal relations. That's the whole stuff about the contract, right? Now again, you're not so used to probably socialists talking a lot about contract, but contract is, for him, a horizontal act, which in principle can allow both sides of both contracting parties win. Now, contract is perverted in the capitalist system. So the wage contract Marx criticized so much is one that does not, in the end, allow each side to come up with equal results because, of course, the capitalist gets to use the workers' work, and the workers' work produces much more for the capitalist, but only poverty or at least hardship for the workers. So you need fair contracts. But still, the contractual model is the basis of at least the industrial part of reorganization, and even the agricultural one, because the peasantry still will be engaged in horizontal relations across, I think, inevitably a market structure. How can contract, however, be the basis of not the economic, which is easier perhaps to see, than a political reorganization? That's where federalism comes in. Because federalism is a contractual system. Now you can start on top, as in the United States they actually started more or less on top, namely already existing sovereign entities making a contract with another. That's not Proudhon's idea. He seems to introduce the idea of federalism that way. But of course, then on the level of Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, Virginia, you will still have the old shit, except that it is not on the level of the nation state or the large territory entity, it will be on the level of the units. And I think Proudhon's idea was pretty much that this is what the United States was. After all, the southern states retained slavery. A sheer mark how federalism did not protect the individual, which is ultimately, I think, Proudhon's goal. So you need federalism all the way down. He seems to imply that that's how it was done in the Swiss Confederation. I'm kind of skeptical that that is historically how it was done. But I mean, he wants to set up a model. So basically, the goal is, both at the level of politics and the level of industry, is to create associations, contrary to what he said about associations 12 years before, at the bottom, group formation. And then these groups are required then, or will be allowed then, to create entities on a higher level. So every single hamlet, which has its own group, would would send delegates, as he says, to the town, where another council is formed. And then the town sends delegates yet to a region, and then finally to the national entity. Contractual horizontal relations are repeated on each level. But how do you guarantee that each higher level is not going to control every lower level in the old way? Well, by giving as few powers to each level higher as you can possibly do it. It's quite a remarkable turn that in the book on federalism, instead of saying you replace authority by liberty, which is his early anarchist view, he now says you're going to combine liberty and authority in every new ways. Every society will always do that. There will always be authority and there will always be liberty. but the goal is to maximize the liberty part and to minimize the anarchy part. Now I end with
You wanted to say the authority.
I'm sorry, the authority part. Minimize, yes, the authority part. Right. One more sentence. You know, Marx, undoubtedly, you can see in Engels' preface to the Civil Wars of France, has been already plagued by the issue of dictatorship. You can examine, and I'm sure you have examined quite often, the Bakunin-Marx debate. And Bakunin constantly is accusing Marx of proposing dictatorship. Now, Marx is not Lenin, and Lenin himself was not Stalin, and so on. But nevertheless, Bakunin sees the possibility of all that in Marx's writings. Engels responds to that in his introduction to the Civil Wars in France. All these gentlemen who worry about dictatorship, he says, well, they should not worry anymore because look at the commune, that's what it is, that's what the dictatorship of the proletariat is. Look at the commune, that is the concrete version of dictatorship of proletariat. That's fine, except is the commune Marxist? My friend says, no. Now, it's a very interesting passage in the beginning where Engels talks about the intellectual founders, the intellectual sources of the commune, and he says, well, the minority follows of Proudhon and the majority follows of Blanqui. But don't worry, once they are doing what they're doing, the Proudhonists will not do a Proudhonian thing in the economy, and the Blanquists will not do a Blanquist authoritarian centralizing thing for the political order. He's right against Blanqui, I would say, but he's certainly wrong against Proudhon. Now, first of all, because the economic model that Engels and then Marx, of course, in the essay itself described, is quite Proudhonian. It's quite Proudhonian, the economic model. The commune is not nationalizing all property. It is just nationalizing the property of the exiles and the ones who really refuse to produce. So it is introducing a mixed system. Of course, was that forever? Was that Marx and Engels, of course, think no, this is just a transitional thing before you get to communist property. But certainly the commune has not introduced also the model of planning. It has maintained market relations and cooperative relations as other coordinating mechanisms. So in fact, Engels is not right against the economic model. And he's even more wrong on the political model, because the political model of the commune is federalist. And it is exactly the pyramidical model that has been introduced by Proudhon himself. Okay, I stop. Of course, you can have an additional time if you would like to comment on any of that or anything that you also still want to introduce, and then we open the floor to the class.
No, just one follow-up question. I think actually we're very complementary. I see a philosopher and a sociologist can actually go together nicely. Do you know whether, because just about the conclusion, the political model of the commune was Proudhonian in the sense of what we have just described in terms of, but do you know, historically speaking, how strong was the influence of Proudhon?
Well, Engels, I get this from Engels. I must say, Benoit said something about this, and we could do this, at least a conference on the commune, because it's an anniversary. I never read really a book on the commune, so I don't really know independently.
Right. Okay.
It's shameful that I haven't.
Do you know?
But we need to read some history, because just the fact that they were Proudhonian, the minority, does not mean that they were doing something right then and there. But Marx and Engels both stress the idea that it's really very strong, that they were, in spite of the Blanquist present, very anti-centralistic. So they said all the hamlets of France will have to have a commune, and then all the towns will have to have a commune of communes. This is what Proudhon in a different context called the confederation of a confederation. He was talking about Europe.
Yeah.
He's a European in his book on his federalism, but it's too big to just create my kind of federalism. So it has to be a confederation of confederations. Well, this model is already, France is already very big too. And the commune, maybe for practical reasons, because after all they only control Paris militarily, maybe for practical reasons is not introducing a centralized model, but politically it seems like they were introducing a decentralized version. The economic one, I don't know. There Marx and Engels could be right, is that this is only a transitional step before they would have nationalized all property. That I don't know. That would be something to really study. But Proudhon would have said, don't do it, because each version of each part of property has something really positive about it. The peasant property is the interest of the majority, and their political independence and their acceptance of transformation depends on it. He thought of the small workshop as a place of innovation. He liked competition, by the way. Again, you will say, what kind of socialist who likes competition? But Proudhon thought competition is positive. It produces creativity. And it's not going to come from the largest, most monopolistic firms.
Right.
So there's a role for the in-between. And of course, the largest firms are important because they have exactly the advantage you stressed, namely the obelisk model. The large firm is capable of pooling labor on the largest possible scale. And so it will be able to do things that would not be possible for the small peasant entrepreneur or even the small workshop. So there would be arguments to keep the plural model of property. And Bukharin and Deng Xiaoping buy this. Do they think of Proudhon? I doubt it. But in any case, they buy the idea, because after all, what property system do you have in China now? You have indeed all the forms, right? Communal ownership, you have small peasant agriculture. Yes, it's a lease system, presumably, which is a debate, by the way, within Proudhon. Do you use leases or do you actually establish inheritable property? He starts with one and he goes to the other. And then, of course, you do have still state ownership. And so in that sense, whether the Paris Commune wanted it this way or not, the idea of this form of reorganization of property. Now, the theoretical question would be, is this pluralistic version exposed to the objections of Proudhon, the author of What is Property? Would it still represent problems of exclusion, of inequality? Would it still represent a potential link to the authoritarian state? That's something that we can discuss later on in the course with historical examples. But I think the idea of having a conference on the commune and actually looking at what they did, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of historiography. So reducing it to Proudhon Marx is a kind of, I used to be a history of ideas, and to me, to some extent, seeing it, and I think this is your method too, seeing it through a major figure helps, but of course, the history of ideas is a misrepresentation of what is involved. And French socialism, it's not true that Saint-Simon no longer has significant followers in all these movements and bodies and so on. But still, but I just use imminent criticism because Engels raises the question of Proudhon and Blanqui too. He says, ha ha ha, they're supposed to be Proudhonian, and look, nothing to do. Proudhon attacked association and they created an associationalist economy and polity. And so how wrong you are, and we of course are right, because this is really what history is producing, namely something which is converging to our theory. But I don't think that this is a fair statement of what is going on.
Right. And just another point is to be historically precise, and one important element that we should not forget is, I think the metaphor of the theater is a nice way to think. It's a beautiful metaphor, but we should not forget that at the time when Proudhon starts writing, the ability to create an association was extremely limited.
Yes.
So you know the commune,
Yes.
there was big
At
revolt
the time when he attacked it, right?
in the 1830s.
Right.
The French laws prevent association larger than 20 or 25 members to exist. So when we talk about advocating for association, you know, the idea of space, we take it in a very abstract and philosophical term, but we should take it in a very material, down-to-earth version, which is there was no association that were allowed. So, you know, socialism is about...
Was that for political reasons?
Of course, I mean, it's the Restoration, so very conservative period, even if there's the July days in the 1830s with a little bit of slightly more freedom granted. We are in a very authoritarian, and so a lot of those authors, they're really fighting, they're theorizing along the struggles to actually have the right to protest on the street, to create association, to create the mutuelle. You know, this is the only way that the workers could actually support one another. So the credit system was actually also embedded in the micro practices of workers trying to self-organize, okay? So the idea of space is very important, and Proudhon, in a way, is very significant because he articulates, you know, and Marx criticism is unfair. I mean, I'm glad you raised the point that Marx has, you know, is highly educated, he goes to class with Hegel, etc. There's a bit of class contempt on Marx and towards Proudhon. Proudhon is a self-taught person, and he tries to think the vocabulary that is needed to go along the political material struggle for that space. So I think we should never forget that those conditions were extremely limited, and Proudhon, really from his little town of Besançon, tried to think out of, you know, the necessity of a larger space, being material and philosophical and theoretical, out of which, you know, you create the association, the federation, etc. It's just a side comment.
Okay. You know, obviously we have a lot more to say, but you know, let's open up the floor.
Can I was
It's
wondering,
loud because you know
Sure.
I don't know what's going on in my hearing.
is there any similarity or common features between Proudhon's conception of federation from down to top and what Marx is explaining the commune as the executive and legislation at the same time, and the fact that the representative of each council could be called back as soon as the members, you know, decided to, or...
Proudhon, in even the section on America, which I said that is kind of interesting, attacks presidentialism. He wants separation of powers, but actually he means what Americans call division of powers. He uses the two terms interchangeably, but he does not want separation of powers because the executive is such a threat, as we all see every day, we should at least see, right? So he's very afraid of that kind of executive who's the, and you see the same in Marx and Tocqueville writing about Bonapartism at the time, Caesarism. They are all very, very nervous about that. So in that sense, when Marx says that the commune is both executive and legislative, he would have probably gotten Proudhon's approval for that. It's another matter about courts, where I think Proudhon at one point had a lot of doubt about whether independent courts are needed or whether they are not dangerous. But toward the end of his life, he began to, especially in the context of federalism, you need more and more courts. The only kind of court then he didn't want is a Supreme Court that can encroach on the independent units. But as far as the executive and the legislature, he didn't want them separated. And the commune, well, of course, it meant that the same body took both, made decrees. They didn't make laws because they're French people and they know the distinction. you couldn't make laws for all of France when it's only Paris legislated, so they made decrees and they carried them out through the National Guard or whatever military force they had. So they were, in that sense, not, but this is not a separation of powers that Proudhon wanted either. You know, I try to anticipate that by referring to Bukharin, or Lenin and Bukharin, and Deng Xiaoping, because they're very practical people. I mean, you know, right? Who could be more practical than Deng? And of course, Lenin was very pragmatic also. Introduction to New Economic Policy. Now you can answer, that was after the taking of power. And so once you took power and put the population under a threat like war communism, or in the case of China, keep the population under a very rigid state socialist system. At least that's my view. I don't want, you know, to give views to you about your own country. But once you've done it, then you decentralize and you move to a kind of in-between system of mixed property and so on, maybe more possible. And I don't know of any example. Well, no, I think we will talk about this in this class. Social democracy in its most radical versions did try to introduce combinations of market, state, and workers' control. So it's not as if it's entirely absent. You didn't ask about the economic formula, you asked about the political one. But you know, the idea of the economic is much more burdensome, of how you're going to make a system like that work with mixed property, avoiding that one of the property forms, the most dynamic one, would encroach on all the rest. Those are really serious problems, and not by the, if you read, we're going to talk about the new economic policy here, the whole discussion is the threat that the reconstructed capitalist property will mean to the rest. Prigozhinsky, Trotsky are very much worried about that, and for good reasons. So, you know, whether such a thing is stable and works is a question. With the political solution, I think that, you know, Proudhon wants to cut that objection off by talking about Switzerland, the Swiss Confederation. And yes, I mean, it is not a pure version of what he has in mind, but nevertheless, it kind of works. It kind of works. And certainly, there are other historical experiments. The problem in the United States is that we have a combination which with a very, very strong potential presidency, and therefore the federal features become weaker and weaker. But why can't the political program be an attractive one for people who really are interested in local autonomy, self-government? I think even in the United States that would not be unattractive. Now, could you establish it? And could you establish it without a radical transformation? That's the question.
One thing that I may add to this, actually two things. So one was that the last time I was teaching Proudhon in a class here last year called Radical Political Thought, somebody from that class told me that actually Proudhon mutualism, mutualist ideas are back, particularly in a lot of attempt to create radically alternative economic association. So this idea of mutualism, of credit, which was never really, mutualism never really flourished in France, but actually, according to what I heard during that class conversation, not only was applied more in the United States, but actually is now back on the scene, so to speak. And thinking about your question, I was thinking of the reason of why that is the case. And the answer that I can give is because the United States, it's a very young state. In contrast to France, for instance, it's relatively younger. So what do I mean by this? I mean that in the same way in which Proudhon, is writing the Critique of Property, and in the Critique of Property, there's actually a section where he compares the private property system with the system of, with state, right? So, can we compare the way in which somebody owns a land and has the right to use and abuse it, whatever way they want, to what sovereign states are doing over their territory? So a sovereign state, we're now so used to thinking that the earth has to be divided in modern states, sovereign state, that we have even lost the historical awareness that a world completely divided in sovereign state, it's actually a relatively recent historical phenomenon. The usual story is that the modern state system begins with the Peace of Westphalia, 1648, but the so-called modern system of sovereign state remained only largely a European creation for centuries. Because in 1648, like a lot of the rest of the world didn't live under sovereign states, but under empires, which doesn't mean that empires were greater, right, and better in any way, but it simply means that there were different forms of political association. And even in Europe, for a very long time, you had overlapping systems of authorities, right? During the Middle Ages, for instance, and for millennia, so to speak. So what I think we can get out of adding somebody like Proudhon, replacing Marx with him, is that, and replacing or combining, I draw from whoever authors I think are able to illuminate aspects of our current conjunction. But I do think that what we get from adding Proudhon is a combination of the critique of private property with the critique of the state and the way in which the logic of the sovereign state with its, what is typical of the modern notion of the sovereign state is that it's territorially bounded, defined, and there's an inside and an outside. So in a way it's largely like the Roman property law. So here there's the land, you can do whatever you want within the land, use or abuse it, right? So what we gain is that you add to the critique of political economy also this dimension to the critique of the state, not only from the point of view of inside of nation state, right? But from the point of view of the globe. Ultimately informed by this idea of the Earth as a theater, right? So we have no planet B, and I do think that there's something which in Proudhon as well as in a lot of anarchists who were working at the time, Élisée Reclus, Kropotkin, a lot of them were scientists. Right? So they studied the way in which processes of life across the globe are interconnected. And there are these pages of Proudhon where he says, well, within this system of private property, you can't even look at a garden, or you can't walk by it and not simply grab fruits because it's regulated by private property. Can you breathe the air? Our species traveling from one place to the other, or when you have waters, how do you establish what waters belong to who? And now we know how much water is important for the reproduction of life, and we have examples of battles over small amount of territories where question about sovereignty, okay, like who's the sovereign there? Right, and who is good in terms of whose life is this right of sovereignty being conceptualized and deployed. So I do think there's a lot to gain actually by adding Proudhon.
He goes through a huge change because in the essay on property, constitutions are really the wrong way to go. You want economic system. You replace constitution with economic system. By the time he goes on to his other works, and I think that in my view, he likes the word anarchist because it tends to piss other people off. But I think that by the time 1850s, he's not an anarchist, and by the time 1860s, even less so. But he talks more and more about constitutions. So, for example, he thinks that
in a very conceptual.
Well, no, he actually wants it to not just abstractly in terms of constitution, in terms of the way the philosopher would use it, but in terms of he wants to establish formally the rules of this economy based on low prices, which he wants to achieve, and I think that has to be ultimately to some kind of state interventionism. And aside from low prices, he wants to establish also the rights of associations to really get credit. So you establish a system of credit. You convert existing properties by expropriations, which would have to be provided for in some legal way. So he has actually what everybody would call it a constitutionally democratic program, which he won't say in that explicit a way because he is attached to his own rhetoric. But I think that you cannot have a federal arrangement like the one he describes. And this everybody knows. Federalism, in the US too, the United States, the whole meaning of constitution changes for the world because of US history. Even France is under the influence of that. And this is because in a federal state, Carl Schmitt makes this point very clear, a federal state you have to have that, because if you're going to have units with power and a center with power and then townships with power, and you always need to have more power the lower down you go, that has to be somehow guaranteed. And that has to be also dealt with when there are jurisdictional fights between the levels. And so the fact that he comes closest to a constitutionalist perspective follows from a federalism. The reason why he goes to federalism is because he cannot give a political form otherwise to his conception. He has no way of establishing the system that he wants without politics. And so I think that Proudhon is almost, I think, should be an object lesson for anarchists in a way, that anarchism in its initial statement of right and wrong is not a politics of any kind. And in order to turn into a politics, he needs to talk about how to get there. That's your question in a way. He needs to go to the formal aspects of what you would have once you get there. And that's all excluded by the initial very radical critique of authority. You know, the fact that the man says now in his book on federalism that the question is how you combine authority and liberty is a very different view than his diatribe against authority in the earlier writings. Authority is just like your father's authority. Get rid of it. Don't be, grow up. You don't want to repeat the patriarchal constraints that you were under when you were 3 years old or 7 years old or 10 years old. We're grown-ups now, we don't need it. And now, suddenly, this is 1862, the text, 22 years later, he wants to combine authority and liberty in the proper way. That's a very different conception. I think even on an abstract philosophical level, a different conception. And I think that's where he goes. Now, should he have gone there? there are plenty of anarchists after Proudhon who don't go there. But in his case, at least, I think he comes to the conclusion that that's what... Now, is it because he gets older and you become more conservative when you're older? I mean...
So I would say, though, that for what concern the early Proudhon, the text on property, it's very clear that there's no freedom without equality. And I think that that's really, and it's also very clear that for him, the sort of anarchy he's talking about is a form of scientific socialism. And I also think that there's nothing farther from Locke and Nozick that the idea that anarchy is a socialism. So in that sense, I think it's important to distinguish the sort of anarchy that Nozick is talking about, so a form of individual anarchism, from the sort of anarchist tradition that Proudhon is part of, which is indeed is part of the socialist tradition. A lot of, for a very long time, also because whereas the northern of Europe was more developed, and so let's say the Marxian type of socialism would make sense, right, to people living in industrializing countries. For a lot of people, for instance, in the south of Europe or the Balkans, they were reading the Communist Manifesto like great, like when we'll see factories, we'll talk about it. But for a very long time, for them, anarchism, the anarchist version of socialism was much more appealing because they were peasants, right? And so when we're talking about the sort of anarchism that Proudhon is embodying, is a tradition, and indeed, and we were talking about Proudhon versus Marx, just because Proudhon as a more elaborated philosophical version than anarchists at the time, but it's a tradition that was there, was alive, and indeed, inside the First International was very well represented. But again, a very different type of anarchism from that of Nozick, where I think...
No, I really think it's sorry.
And also Locke, and also from Locke, because I think for Locke as well, Can I respond?
Sure.
Okay, so actually he thinks that there are places where he says that the differences in natural faculty and talents and ideas and competitions is good to equality, because we are endowed with different faculties, so to speak, and different talents. So if there is if there's competition around, there's more spontaneously a sort of natural division of labor, so that people who do things in which they excel, and things in which they excel are things that they're naturally more prone to. On the contrary, it says if you completely abolish competition and you just assign tasks bottom up, you destroy people, natural interests or inclinations for things for which they may have talent they will never know about. So it doesn't see a contradiction between them. At least
but there are questions involved in this, which I think are contradictions of his, not ours. Namely, for example, he wants to equalize wages. That's in this book, he wants to totally equalize all wages. He abandons that subsequently in the later text. But what's the competition if you equalize wages? What are you competing over? He wants to control prices, even in the later writings, because because one of the things that actually is injurious to the majority of people in any country of his time.
Yeah, but let's keep your first example, which is, perhaps the strongest. How can you equalize wages and still expect people to compete?
Exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
that's a good question.
Well, he has
Do you
nothing.
think that's impossible, or?
Well, I mean, certainly in the case of artists, they can compete with even no pay, because after all, most people who are in plastic arts don't even make any money. So there are certain occupations where you do compete, but I mean,
This is a good example. People don't only compete, to assume that people only compete for money,
athletes.
that there's only competition for money and
Yeah.
better wages,
Yeah.
is already assuming the sort of capitalist ethos according to which the accumulation of profit
Yeah, I get it. No,
is
of
the
course.
only moral to competition. I'm saying this because when I was teaching this class on radical political thought to an undergraduate class, that was constantly always the question, right? But for me, it was like, we are so imbued in the idea of profit that we cannot think of any other drive in any other economic force besides the accumulation of profit, right? So why would people compete if the wages are equal? Because, here is the point. Is writing in a moment when capitalism, let's say, a system predicated on the endless accumulation of profit as the ultimate value of somebody's life, was only beginning, right? So you can still see the value of alternative economic models, for instance, subsistence models, right? It's not that people, the accumulation of endless profit is the only forms of organization that human beings have experienced, throughout their history. So it's only one among different ways. And this idea, to me, I remember when the students had such a hard time, like, how can you equalize wages? And then, why do people get out of bed in the morning? And I was like, do you only get out of bed in order to get a better wage? I mean, is that the only thing that gets people out of bed these days? It's a very question. I mean, have we so internalized this idea of endless profit that we can't conceive of any other driving force? Okay, these are huge questions. So, and let me just try to summarize and be brief, because I know you have classes. The critique of what the anarchists are criticizing is the institution of the model state. This doesn't mean pure chaos, that they want to abolish all form of political organization. And it doesn't mean that what they want is pure individualism. Actually, that's a very minoritarian current of anarchism, individualist anarchists. We think that there are only individuals, and way more prominent in the United States than in Europe. I've never met an individualist anarchist in Europe. So the same way in which in modern time, people provide to services at local levels would still be the same in the sort of I think, system based on federation that Proudhon is providing. So the difference is that instead of being a top-down approach, it's a bottom-up. So you begin by federating at the smallest level, and you fulfill the needs that can be fulfilled locally. And then and that's what Andrew was mentioning in terms of you keep as much power as you can at the lower level, and then you build up, and as the level becomes more complex, you are careful that there are not shift of powers which are not absolutely needed. So actually you give as less power as possible to the top.
The one thing he mentions, and I'll end with that, in that context, because if you're from the United States, you will know the doctrine of states' rights, right? I mean, most of the people that I get my students, my classes are foreign, but states' rights, of course, means in American discussion the right of the various states, 50 now, 13 originally, to control most of their own affairs. It is like this Proudhonian scheme of leaving power there. But this is also a doctrine under which slavery, Jim Crow, the exclusion of people from the vote, and many other things was always justified, states' rights. Proudhon, by the way, very, very, very interesting, in the American Civil War, he says he's with the South on all issues except for slavery. Right? But you can't just except for slavery, because that's one of the major motivations for the Southern states. So Proudhon is guarded against this. He thinks the center has a right to reinforce the autonomy of the individual. This is a pyramid which has actually individuals at the bottom. And to say that you defer to the intermediary level, the middle, that is going to exploit and penalize the real bottom is unacceptable. So in some ways, there's a need for federal jurisdiction. He doesn't want to have a court doing it. I'm not quite sure if he thought war was the best way of doing it. But in any case, how that is done is a question. But certainly there are functions for the center, which of course means in my terminology that he still has a state, right? Because to abolish the Jim Crow system, you needed federal legislation because the southern states themselves were quite unwilling to do that. So integration of schools, voting rights, non-discrimination for jobs for racial reasons, these are enacted in the United States. I don't know.
Except that if you had a Proudhonian system, you would have not had a settler colonial state in the first place, and so you
well, you can't. You see, here's the problem: is that whatever system you have, if you have actually ceded all powers to the lower levels, then they can do things. They can do things. For example, they can establish wages differentials, what we talked about before. I mean, and if you say they cannot, you're giving power to somebody to stop them. So no matter how your starting point can be beautiful, and every respect satisfying his principles, but autonomy means people can do stuff.
Right.
And they do a lot of bad stuff on all levels.
Right.
And how do you guard against that? Okay.
That's a good point to
Yes.
stop. Thank you, everybody.